The Middle East, basically the chunk of Asia that Europeans decided was in the middle of what they called the East. It's a label built from a European point of view, which is why it feels a little strange and a little subjective, pretty arbitrary. Whatever, that's the name that stuck, so that's the name we're using. This area is also the place people point to when they say civilization started here, right around what we'd describe today as modern Iraq. Early cities, early farming societies, early record keeping, early laws, the whole human history level up zone. And because it has mattered to so many groups for so long, the map hasn't exactly stayed still. Empires have rolled in, ruled for a while, faded out, and then another empire has tried again. And every time that happens, borders shift, names change, capitals move, and someone redraws the lines like they're updating a giant group project where nobody can agree on the final version. A very talented YouTuber put it together, and that person deserves, at minimum, some kind of medal for making centuries of complicated history look that smooth, that clear, and that watchable. Anyway, the most recent big "let's carve this place up" moment was driven by European powers. The French, the British, the Russians, the usual suspects showing up with rulers, treaties, and a lot of confidence, deciding what the region should look like on paper. Of course it was the British. Of course it was the French. Of course it was Europeans doing a very European thing. The problem is, the lines they drew weren't really about what made sense for the people living there, not about who spoke what language, which communities lived next to each other, what histories they shared, or what regional identities actually existed on the ground. They mostly just sliced the region into neat-looking pieces that suited their own interests, and then basically announced, "Cool, these are our shiny new zones of power in the Middle East now," as if naming it and mapping it automatically made it stable and legitimate. Eventually, those European empires backed out, but the borders they left behind didn't vanish with them. Those drawn-in-a-boardroom boundaries stuck around, and they became the rough skeleton of the modern map, the outlines that still shape what countries look like today, even when those outlines don't always match the real-life mix of cultures, religions, and identities inside them. And that's where our story actually begins. The 1930s, in the Middle East as we recognize it now, with those inherited borders already on the page and the next set of consequences ready to unfold. We've got the map. We've got the modern Middle East taking shape. So why does the US end up caring so much about what happens there? Oil. Before the 1900s, if you wanted power, you needed the classic stuff: land, people, factories, coal. Then the early 20th century shows up and basically says, "Congrats, war just got upgraded." World War I is when modern warfare really kicks in. Vehicles, tanks, planes, massive supply chains. And all of that runs on fuel. Suddenly, oil isn't just a useful resource. It's the thing that makes an industrial military even work. So if you're a country trying to stay powerful or become more powerful, you don't just want oil. You need oil. And you need it reliably, in huge quantities, for a long time. The problem: a lot of the planet's most valuable oil isn't sitting inside the US, or at least not enough to comfortably ignore everyone else. It's sitting in places the US doesn't control, which means the Middle East isn't just somewhere far away with complicated history. It becomes a region that can decide who gets to move armies, who gets to run economies, and who stays on top. And once oil becomes that important, the story stops being "how did borders get drawn?" and turns into "who gets access to the fuel that runs the modern world?" So here's where the US story in the Middle East really starts to lock in. In the 1930s, a US oil company from California decides to take a swing at something that, at the time, looks like a long shot. Go search for oil in Saudi Arabia. And this isn't like showing up to a friendly business park with a PowerPoint. Saudi Arabia is newly consolidated, culturally very conservative, and built around a strict religious identity. Foreign outsiders aren't exactly treated like casual visitors, especially if they seem like they're bringing outside influence along with them. But the Saudi king needs money to build and stabilize the country, and the Americans are offering cash and expertise. So a deal gets made. The company gets permission to explore and drill. Then comes the brutal part: the desert. The company sends crews and equipment into a place that's hot, remote, and incredibly difficult to work in. They drill, nothing. They drill again, still nothing. They keep sinking money into the ground while people back home start thinking, "This is a waste, pull out." But they don't. They stay, they dig deeper, and eventually they hit the breakthrough. On March 3, 1938, they finally strike a well that actually produces major oil. And once that happens, everything changes. What started as a gamble turns into one of the most important oil relationships on Earth, setting up the long-term US-Saudi partnership and the bigger chain reaction the video is building toward. Once that 1938 discovery happens, the drilling isn't just a project anymore. It turns into a whole American operation living inside Saudi Arabia. The oil company starts building these self-contained mini-Americas out in the desert. Housing, facilities, roads, everything the workers need. And the vibe is basically Americans over here living their American lifestyle, while right outside that fence is a very different society with strict religious rules and a strong sense of protecting its culture from outside influence. So even though the partnership is making the Saudi leadership money, there's still a lot of tension underneath it, because a visible foreign presence can feel like more than business. It can feel like influence. Then the US relationship deepens in a way that goes past oil. The video says the US ends up getting permission to build a military landing strip/base near the oil area, an early foothold that links protect the oil relationship with US military presence. But because Saudi leaders don't want it to look like the Americans are straight up planting a permanent flag in the country, the deal comes with symbolic limits. The video highlights one of them as a kind of darkly funny detail. No flagpoles. Basically, you can be here, but don't make it look like you're claiming anything. So you've got this weird arrangement forming. America is physically present, oil towns plus military infrastructure. Saudi Arabia is benefiting financially, but there's also a constant pressure to keep the presence from looking like occupation. And that's the foundation the rest of the story builds on. Because once a base exists just to help, it becomes a lot easier for future US involvement to expand. Saudi Arabia is getting richer and modernizing fast, which means there's suddenly a gigantic demand for people who can build things: roads, buildings, infrastructure, all the physical stuff a rapidly developing country needs. That's where Mohammed bin Laden comes in. The video introduces him as a major construction figure who benefits from and helps drive Saudi Arabia's rapid expansion. He becomes extremely successful by being the guy who can get huge projects done, and his company grows into a powerhouse alongside the country's transformation. At the same time, the US-Saudi partnership is getting tighter. Oil money and American influence are flowing in, and the relationship starts looking less like a business deal and more like a long-term strategic connection, the kind that shapes the region's future. Then the narrator does a deliberate story move. He sets up Mohammed bin Laden's family as an important thread and drops the twist. Mohammed has a lot of children, and the video points out that one of his sons is named Osama bin Laden. And that's the cliffhanger moment. It's basically the narrator saying, "Remember this name, because the oil story you thought was just about money and power is about to collide with a person who becomes one of the biggest consequences of the entire era." At this point, the video basically says, okay, oil got the US into the Middle East, but the Cold War is what makes everything way more intense. After World War II, the US isn't just thinking about fuel and business deals anymore. It's thinking about global strategy. The Soviet Union is the rival superpower, and the Middle East is suddenly a major chessboard. Important location, important resources, and a lot of countries that could, in theory, fall into either camp. Then the video jumps to Iran as a huge example of the US choosing control and stability over leave it alone. It describes an Iranian leader who tries to take back more national control of Iran's oil, which threatens Western oil interests. And the narrator says that the US, along with Britain, supports a behind-the-scenes move to remove him and back a replacement ruler, someone who's more friendly to Western goals. From the video's point of view, this works in the short term, but it plants a long-term anger that doesn't just disappear. Then it pivots to Israel. The video frames US support for Israel as another major piece of the Cold War-era Middle East equation. America becomes Israel's biggest backer, and that doesn't just affect Israel. It reshapes how surrounding countries see the US, too. And this is where oil swings back into the story as a weapon. The narrator describes how oil-producing countries respond to US support for Israel by using their leverage, restricting oil supply, driving up prices, and creating real shockwaves in the West. The gas lines and panic imagery is basically the video's way of saying, see, the Middle East can hit the US at home just by turning the oil tap. So the section's main point is, oil draws the US into the region, the Cold War pushes the US into deeper vmeshatelstvo, intervention mode, and US alliances, especially Israel, trigger backlash that comes right back through oil and public anger. By the late 1970s, the relationship between the United States and the Middle East is no longer just about agreements and oil contracts. It has become emotional tied to identity, faith, and the presence of foreign power. The video shifts focus to a growing current inside Saudi society, the belief that Western influence is not simply inconvenient, but corrupting, and that foreign military footprints, especially on sacred ground, are unacceptable. In this framing, Osama bin Laden becomes a symbol of that reaction. Raised inside a wealthy, well-connected Saudi family, he is portrayed as increasingly drawn toward a hardline religious worldview, one that treats the region's holiest places as non-negotiable and views outside influence as a direct threat. Then comes a turning point: Iran's 1979 revolution. A US-aligned government falls, replaced by a new regime defined in opposition to American power. The video presents this moment as a shockwave, proof that a major country in the region can reject the US outright, and that public anger can reshape history. The documentary notes how the US becomes, in the eyes of many across the region, more than a distant superpower. It becomes a visible actor, supporting certain governments, backing key allies, and increasingly tied to controversial decisions. And in the narrator's storyline, this is the environment that accelerates bin Laden's transformation. The sense that the region's future is being decided by outsiders, and that resisting those outsiders is not just political, but religious. By the end of this section, the video is setting up the next stage, a conflict where ideology, superpower rivalry and armed struggle collide, creating the conditions for new militant networks to form. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Afghanistan becomes one of the Cold War's most consequential battlegrounds, not because it is wealthy, but because it is strategic. The Soviet Union moves into Afghanistan to shore up a friendly government. What follows is a long, grinding conflict, one that pulls in regional powers, outside money, and competing ideologies. The video frames the American reaction in Cold War terms. The Soviet Union is now tied down in a costly war, and the United States sees an opportunity. According to the narrator, the U.S. begins supporting anti-Soviet fighters indirectly, supplying resources through regional partners rather than marching in openly. In this telling, Afghanistan becomes a pipeline. International funding, weapons, training networks, and volunteers moving through the region, all focused on one goal: pushing back the Soviets. The documentary then returns to Osama bin Laden's role. It portrays him as drawn to Afghanistan's war not simply as politics, but as a religious cause, traveling to support the fight, helping finance and organize, and building relationships with other militants and commanders. Over time, the video suggests, these networks begin to outlast the original war. The conflict doesn't just produce battlefield experience, it produces connections, identity, and an ideology that can be carried elsewhere. When the Soviets eventually withdraw, the narrator argues the story does not end. Instead, the infrastructure of militancy, people, roots, funding channels, and shared purpose remains in place. And in the video's framing, this is the moment where blowback takes shape. The same conflict that weakened a superpower also helps create new organizations, including what it identifies as Al-Qaeda, groups that will later redirect their focus toward the United States and its allies. 1990. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invades Kuwait. The video presents it as a sudden escalation with global consequences. Kuwait is small, oil-rich, and strategically placed. And the invasion sends an immediate signal across the region, especially to Saudi Arabia. Saudi leaders fear that if Kuwait can fall, Saudi territory could be next. The stakes are not only political, but symbolic. The kingdom contains Islam's holiest sites, and the idea of a hostile army advancing toward them is treated as an urgent crisis. The documentary then centers a pivotal decision. Osama bin Laden, already shaped by the Afghan war and his militant networks, is shown offering a solution rooted in ideology. He proposes mobilizing fighters to defend the kingdom, framing it as a religious duty and an Islamic defense of sacred ground. In the video's telling, Saudi leadership rejects the offer. Instead, they choose a different kind of protection. They invite a U.S.-led coalition to deploy forces to Saudi Arabia. Operation Desert Shield begins. The buildup. The region fills with foreign soldiers, equipment, and air power. When the coalition moves to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait, the campaign is swift and overwhelming. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq is pushed back. But the narrator emphasizes what remains after the battlefield victory: the expanded U.S. presence. In the documentary's framing, this is the turning point, because troops do not simply arrive, win, and vanish. A long-term posture takes shape. And for bin Laden, the video argues, this decision becomes a defining grievance. Foreign forces stationed in the land of holy sites by invitation of the Saudi state, an outcome he treats not as protection, but as humiliation and betrayal. By the end of this section, the story has narrowed to a single pressure point: a superpower establishing deep military roots in a region it once entered through oil, while a new militant movement interprets that presence as a reason for war. After the Gulf War, the video argues that the most important outcome isn't only what happened in Kuwait, it's what happened afterward. The United States and its coalition partners had moved enormous military capacity into the region. And while the immediate mission, pushing Iraq out of Kuwait, was completed, the infrastructure and posture built for that war did not fully disappear when the fighting ended. In the documentary's framing, this is the moment the U.S. presence changes character. From a temporary deployment to a lasting footprint, bases, logistics, and ongoing operations that keep American forces close to the region's oil routes and political flashpoints. The narrator presents this as a kind of momentum. Once the U.S. has the capability to operate from the region, it becomes easier to justify staying just in case, to deter threats, to respond quickly, to protect allies, and to defend the flow of energy resources. But the video stresses the cost of that permanence. The longer foreign forces remain, the more their presence becomes fuel for anger, especially for militants who see those bases not as defense, but as occupation by another name. By this point in the story, bin Laden is no longer being presented as a side character. He is positioned as a product of the era, someone whose ideology hardens as U.S. influence expands, and whose anger is focused on what he frames as foreign troops in the land of Islam's holiest sites.